Today is March 13th, 2023. I want to talk about the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. As I usually do, let's take a look at the map. This is liveuamap.com. It is a pro-Ukrainian live map, so keep that in mind when we look at it. Again, in case you don't know, what is in red is controlled by Russia. Again, the Dnieper River serves as a natural defense line in Kherson and part of Zaporozhye. There is a troop buildup of Russian forces in Zaporozhye. They've been investing heavily in defense lines in this area. There is on and off fighting around Vuhledar right here. But what we are seeing now is a lot of fighting around Avdiivka. This is the city that Ukraine has used to shell the civilian population of Donetsk city right here for 9 years. I also want to point out that Avdiivka is a heavily fortified city, and it is one of these heavily fortified cities along this defense line Ukraine has in the Donbas region. And this defense line includes Bakhmut, which, as you can see, continues to be surrounded by Russian forces. This map indicates that Russian forces actually control the eastern half of the city, separated by this waterway. Soledar and Krasnogora, these were also fortified cities that Ukrainian forces included in this defensive line. Russian forces now control them and the surrounding areas. You will notice how once Russian forces took Soledar and Krasnogora, taking the rest of this surrounding territory was fast going. And I'm going to get into this point here in a little bit. And then to the north is Seversk, and then there's the Oskol River here, and this buffer zone here. That is where the line of contact goes all the way up to the Russian-Ukrainian border here, and Kharkov. Why is Ukraine determined to hold on to Bakhmut? Surely there are political elements in all of this that have painted them into a corner that do not allow them to give up territory, even when it makes military sense to do so. But what I will say is, because these are fortified cities, fortifications built up over the course of months, if not years, when they fall back, they will be falling back to places not nearly as well defended as these cities. They're fighting, they're dying in huge numbers right now, but if they were to fall back to areas harder to defend, less built up in terms of urban areas, when they are fighting Russian forces, they will be losing even more troops than they already are, if you could imagine that. So that is why they're clinging to these cities, these fortified cities. And again, as you saw, when they broke through Soledar, then taking the rest of the territory in the surrounding area was very fast going, because it's much harder for Ukrainian forces falling back to defend. This is all about attrition. This is what Russia is doing. This is what they have repeatedly said they are doing. They're not fighting in Bakhmut to take the city of Bakhmut, although incrementally that is what's happening. The main purpose of doing this is to consume Ukrainian manpower and equipment, and that is exactly what is happening now. What about these losses? How bad are these losses? This is an article from the BBC from the within the last 24 hours. Ukraine war, heavy losses reported as battle for Bakhmut rages. And the article says Ukraine and Russia have reported inflicting heavy losses as the battle for Bakhmut rages on. Moscow has been trying to take the eastern Ukrainian city for months in a grinding war of attrition. Exactly, it is a war of attrition. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said Russian forces had suffered more than 1,100 deaths in the past few days, with many more seriously injured. Russia said it has killed more than 200 Ukrainian service members over the past 24 hours, and between 200 and 300 dead Ukrainian soldiers per day is what Kiev itself has admitted in the past to the number of troops that they are losing when they are trying to defend cities like this. And this was the case with Severodonetsk and Lysychansk. The BBC also says they are unable to verify the numbers given by either side, but that actually isn't true. And I'll get to that in just a moment. The BBC actually does have an ongoing project where they are verifying these numbers. So it's very clear they just don't want to verify the numbers for the sake of this article. The article also says, analysts say Bakhmut has little strategic value, but has become a focal point for Russian commanders who have struggled to deliver any positive news to the Kremlin. But the Kremlin itself has said they are fighting a war of attrition. This is not about territorial conquest. This is about demilitarizing Ukraine. So every single day when huge numbers of Ukrainian troops and their equipment is destroyed, and far fewer men and machines on the Russian side are destroyed, that is good news for the Kremlin. It's also demonstrably not true that this has little strategic value. Bakhmut is one of these major fortified cities along this defensive line. So how is it not strategic? And even if Bakhmut only served as a focal point for Russian forces to pull in and destroy Ukraine's military, for that reason alone, it is strategically valuable. Now, getting back to the casualty numbers, the BBC claims Western officials estimate between 20,000 and 30,000 Russian troops have been killed or injured so far in and around Bakhmut. Not in the total fighting since February of 2022, but just in Bakhmut alone, they claim 20,000 to 30,000 killed or injured. And this is an utterly absurd number, just as their number of between 100 and 200,000 dead and injured Russian troops. They never break this number down. They never explain it. They never provide any evidence to substantiate it. And then this brings me back to the BBC and this project that they've been doing together with a media outlet called Media Zona. And I want to show you this article, which actually comes from the Kiev Independent. And this was published just this month, March 4th. Public data suggests over 16,000 Russian soldiers have been killed during the first year of all-out war. This is the total, they are claiming, of Russian soldiers who have perished in this fighting. And they are doing this by scouring public records and social media. And ironically, this number, 16,000, is much closer to the Russian Ministry of Defense's own number regarding Russian losses than these absurd claims of 100,000 to 200,000 coming from even the Pentagon. And again, they never substantiate these numbers or break them down. So if it's 16,000 for the whole year of fighting, obviously Russia hasn't lost 20 to 30,000 around Bakhmut alone. This is just war propaganda. It's already obvious to many people, even people who are supportive of Kiev. It's very obvious that a lot of people are starting to wonder why is Ukraine fighting on? Why are they stubbornly fighting at Bakhmut? It's almost inevitable that they will lose the city, and they're losing huge numbers of troops in the process. If the Western media and Western governments were honest about how badly Ukraine actually was losing, then overall morale for the public and probably even the soldiers on the battlefield would collapse. Now, there's certain aspects of this fighting admitted by the Western media that backs up these claims that Russia is losing far fewer troops than Ukraine is, and that all of this talk about Russia, it's actually Russia that's in the trap. Bakhmut is a trap for Russia. This is all pure war propaganda. And I want to show you some of these articles and the points that they bring up. So this is from the Washington Post, again, March 6th, a couple of days ago. Biden must follow Roosevelt's arsenal of democracy example. And you see there's an artillery shell there. And it says, the most pressing need in Ukraine is the supply of 155 millimeter howitzer shells, which in recent months have become the main munition holding Russia at bay. The United States has supplied more than 1 million to Ukraine since the war's outset, according to the Pentagon. Ukrainian artillery units have been firing them at a rate of roughly 3,000 a day, perhaps one-third the number of rounds screaming back at them from the Russian side. The math is unforgiving. Not only is Ukraine's inventory dwindling, but the US pre-war production of the shells fewer than 15,000 per month, scarcely enough to sustain Ukraine for 5 days. And this has been something that I've been talking about for months and months and months now, and now finally the Western media is forced to confront this very real problem. I want to point this out too. So we're talking about the quantity of shells. There's this article from the Financial Times. This is from March, just earlier this month. Ukraine asks EU for 250,000 artillery shells a month. Good luck with that. And it says Ukraine has appealed to the EU to send Kiev 250,000 shells a month to ease a critical shortage that it warns is limiting its progress on the battlefield. In the letter to his counterparts in the 27 member states on Friday, obtained by the Financial Times, Ukraine's defense minister writes that his country's forces are only firing a fifth of the rounds they could because of lack of supplies. The request far exceeds the help the EU is discussing sending, underlining the size of the task facing Kiev as its war with Russia enters a second year. And then they talk about this defense minister. He writes that artillery plays a crucial role in eliminating the enemy's military power. On average, Ukraine was firing 110,000 155 millimeter caliber shells a month. He says a quarter of the amount used by Russia. So a third to a quarter of what Russia is firing. Both the Washington Post and the Financial Times, citing Western analysts and even the Ukrainian defense minister, are explaining to you how badly outgunned Ukraine is. And what is my point here? My point is, if they are this badly outgunned, how are they inflicting more casualties on Russia than they are sustaining? I want to point something else out in this Financial Times article. It says defense analysts say Kiev has more than 300 artillery systems, mostly donated by allies. And I want to point out that at the beginning of the conflict, they had over 1,000 artillery systems. Russia had over 1,000 artillery systems. Russia has been systematically destroying these artillery systems, and between that and exhausting their shell supply for their Soviet-era artillery systems, they're down to 300. Russia still has over 1,000 artillery pieces out on the battlefield. And so it's not just the quantity of rounds being fired, it's the number of artillery pieces firing these rounds. And this is important for many, many different reasons. And I just want to point out one of these reasons. The barrels on these guns wear out. And after you fire a certain number of shells, you have to replace the barrel. So for Ukraine, they have 300 guns. They're firing them at maximum rates. They wear out. They have to go 1,000 kilometers to Poland to get their barrels replaced and then come 1,000 kilometers back to the front line. On the other hand, Russia has many more guns. They don't have to fire as many per gun. They could just bring in more guns. They have more guns in reserve. When one gun goes down, they can bring another one in. So this is not a problem for Russia. This is a huge problem for Ukraine. And what it does is it diminishes its combat potential as time goes on. As they lose guns, they're not getting these guns replaced fast enough. This is going to negatively impact their combat potential over time. And it has been, and it is. So considering all of this, looking at this narrative that they're trying to create around Bakhmut, that it's actually Russia trapped, and they're losing so many more men, and that's why Ukraine is there. I've actually seen articles in the West claiming that Ukraine is sticking around Bakhmut because they are killing so many more Russians than the casualties they themselves are sustaining. And it just simply doesn't make any sense. They are clearly outgunned, and they're clearly taking far more losses than Russia. And this is the entire strategy Russia is pursuing. Speaking of Bakhmut, we continue to hear rumors from both sides about some impending Ukrainian counteroffensive. They have seemingly launched smaller offensives. I'm talking about a very, very large offensive. Again, this is a rumor, but this is just something to keep an eye out for. And I want to explain why a major counteroffensive around Bakhmut carried out by Ukraine would actually be a sign of desperation and will negatively impact Ukraine in the short and intermediate term. Like I pointed out, Russia has already said that its operations around Bakhmut are aimed at grinding down Ukrainian manpower and equipment, of course pushing Ukrainian forces out of these fortified positions in Bakhmut to places that are much harder to defend will accelerate the process. So obviously that is something they would like to do, but the main point is attrition, inflicting more losses than Russia is suffering. That is the main point. So if there is a counteroffensive, if it's particularly large and it is well organized and well armed, and it does manage to threaten Russian forces with heavy losses or the potential of being encircled, as Russian forces have done many times before, they most likely will withdraw, because the point is not to take the city. The point is to inflict more losses on Ukraine than they themselves suffer, stubbornly holding their ground, getting encircled, losing huge numbers of troops. That does not fit into the overall plan. So that is something that I think we will most likely see. You can never tell, but that is what Russia has been doing up until now. And that is one point to keep in mind ahead of a potential major counteroffensive. I want to point something else out about the similarities between the political atmosphere surrounding Bakhmut and the political atmosphere surrounding the Syrian city of Aleppo. And this was a city that was fought over from between 2012 and 2016. It ended in 2016 with a Syrian victory over these Western-sponsored extremists. And if you look at the time lapse of the battle, you see how it's unfolding, and you will notice how at certain times, Syrian forces indicated in red, it seemed as if they were at risk of being cut off and encircled. And you could see how there were multiple attempted breakthroughs, both from within the encirclement and extremists fighting outside of the encirclement. They did actually break through. But even when you break through, unless you change the fundamentals that led to you being encircled in the first place, not having enough manpower, not having enough equipment, not having enough munitions, if you don't fix these fundamentals, even when you break through, it's just going to be reversed. It will be a temporary breakthrough, and it will be reversed. And that applies to Bakhmut. If Russia still has the advantage in manpower, weapons, equipment, ammunition, even if Ukraine is successful with their counteroffensive, it'll be temporary and it will be reversed. And I want to show you this article from The Economist from 2016 regarding Aleppo. Rebels break the siege of Aleppo, but at a cost. The first good news in many months from Syria's suffering city. And this is from 2016, which is when Syrian forces finally did win the Battle of Aleppo, and they completely eliminated the militant presence there altogether. So let's just take a look at how they reported this. It says, ever since Russia entered the Syrian civil war on the side of the Syrian regime led by Bashar al-Assad, rebel groups in Aleppo have been progressively isolated and besieged, kind of like how Ukrainian forces are being isolated and besieged in Bakhmut. Despair, it seems, forced a show of unity by the disparate rebel groups with striking effect. On the weekend of August 6th and 7th, mainstream and jihadist groups used suicide bombers, artillery guns, and tanks to break through regime positions. The rebels seized the military complex, captured weapons and ammunition, and opened a narrow corridor into areas that had been under government blockade for weeks. The lightning advance took Syrian government forces by surprise. They have responded with fury. The regime has stepped up its bombardment of rebel-held parts of the city as it seeks to reverse the opposition's successes. Activists in eastern Aleppo say that they have counted more than 100 airstrikes over the past 2 days. The shelling is so fierce that aid workers still have no reliable route into the east of the city, and the transfer of supplies is dangerous and limited. The siege has been broken, but the road in has yet to be fully secured, so no food or fuel has reached the inner parts of the city, said one activist in Aleppo. But the rebels, again gaining ground, Mr. Assad's forces in their side of the city, and the 1.2 million civilians under their control now risk being encircled themselves. And in reality, the breakthrough was the last gasp by these Western-sponsored extremists. The idea that this was on a stepping stone on the way to the militants' victory. This is going to be the same type of propaganda we're going to have to listen to if there is some sort of successful Ukrainian counteroffensive around Bakhmut. But again, the fundamentals that are causing Ukrainian forces to find themselves encircled in places like Bakhmut, if those are not addressed, and they're not going to be, then it will be temporary. And I want to add to that. I want to point out that when Ukrainian forces go from fighting Russian forces around Bakhmut from their defensive positions, when they go out in the open on the offensive, because they are admittedly outgunned so badly by Russian firepower, that's what they are going to be out in the open facing, all of that firepower. Their losses are going to be tremendous, just like during the Kharkov offensive and the Kherson offensive, which is why we hear some people say, well, they're holding on in Bakhmut to buy time for a whole army's worth of equipment to arrive, because they lost a whole army's worth of equipment during those last two offensives. And then finally, I want to point out that if they do commit to some sort of major offensive, again, we don't know, but I'm just saying if they do, they are going to be using better trained forces, some of their best equipment to carry out this counteroffensive if they wanted to have any success of succeeding. And that is going to be diverting men and equipment away from this spring offensive they keep talking about. They want to cut the land bridge between Crimea and the rest of Russia. They're going to be diverting manpower and equipment to this counteroffensive. It'll be less that they have on hand for that that spring offensive. And this is what I've said repeatedly, that what we're looking at right now is not the Russian winter offensive. There is no Russian winter offensive per se. They are putting pressure all along the line of contact to deny Ukraine any window of opportunity to organize its forces. They're forcing Ukraine to commit troops and equipment all along the line of contact to prevent breakthroughs, to prevent Bakhmut from being encircled and falling. And those forces would have otherwise, if there was some sort of temporary pause, they would have been preparing for the spring offensive. So all things to consider. Now, finally, I want to talk about this article. This is from the Telegraph right here. Poland builds Europe's largest land force to counter Russian threat. Warsaw is embarking on its biggest rearmament drive in 50 years in response to the growing threat posed by Russia. And they show you all of this NATO equipment, M270 multiple launch rocket system, and an M1 Abrams. And then they start talking about numbers. They say, to start with, it has placed orders for 1,000 K2 main battle tanks from South Korea, 250 brand new M1A2 SEP-V version 3 Abram tanks from the US. This will turn Poland into the owner of Europe's largest tank force, dwarfing the UK's fleet of 227. I don't think that it's hard to have a larger tank fleet than the UK. But that perhaps they're just pointing this out because it's a British newspaper. Its artillery will be bolstered by the arrival of 600 K9s, 18 HIMARS launchers with 9,000 rockets, and 288 K239 MLR systems, well, multiple launch rocket systems from South Korea. Over 1,000 Polish-made infantry fighting vehicles will carry Polish troops into battle, while air cover will come from 96 Apache helicopters bought from the US and 48 FA-50 combat aircraft now on order from South Korea. All of this will be underscored by plans to double the size of the Polish army to 300,000, which would turn Poland into Europe's biggest military power in terms of manpower west of Ukraine, because Ukraine has more manpower. And as a matter of fact, I want to point this article out because I see maybe some people are concerned, and they should be concerned about this, because this is the West doubling down on this confrontation with Russia. But Ukraine had over 1,000 tanks before the special military operation began in February last year. They had over 1,000 tanks, they had over 1,000 artillery pieces, thousands and thousands of other armored vehicles. They had hundreds of multiple launch rocket systems, their own Soviet-era systems that they were very familiar with. They had a formidable integrated air defense network, and they still kind of do. It's still kind of holding off Russian air power from being fully utilized. And they had their own air force, both warplanes and helicopters, and the vast majority of this has disappeared. And the West is unable to replace it. And what Poland is doing is building a force about at the same level as Ukraine's. And by the way, all of this is on order. This is all going to take years and years for all of this to come together, if it comes together. And it's going to cost Poland immensely, because just as the US overspends on wars of aggression all around the globe and having this huge military to threaten and coerce other nations with, all of this money going to building this huge military up for Poland is going to be diverted from everywhere else in society. And the Telegraph article actually says, I have said many times that it's better to be in debt and even have to make cuts to budgets in other areas than to be occupied. And this is the leader of the Law and Justice Party in Poland's governing ruling party, and considered by many to be the most powerful politician in the country earlier this year. This is what he said earlier this year. Whoever has seen what is happening in Ukraine should have no doubt about this. Russia has no plans of invading Poland. They have no plans on attacking NATO in general. And so the only way this military will end up being used is if Poland decides to go into Ukraine and confront Russian forces there. And again, if they do that, what makes them think that this force is going to fare any better than the Ukrainians have fared? And what will happen is this hardware will be liquidated. This is billions of dollars of equipment that will be gone, along with thousands of Polish troops operating it. So what will that all be for? That will be for this ongoing U.S. proxy war against Russia, where they are done consuming the lives and resources of Ukraine, and now they're going to recruit Poland and feed them into the proxy war. That is the whole point of this. So Bakhmut and what's going on there, and whether or not Ukraine organizes a massive counteroffensive, that is something to keep an eye on in the short term. And these attempts by NATO to expand their military and keep this proxy war going for as long as possible, that is something we have to keep an eye on in the intermediate and long term. Because again, when they talk about these huge numbers of weapons, a lot of this hasn't even been built yet, and that will take years to do. If you thought this video was useful, please like and share. Think about subscribing. It's free to do. It helps the channel grow. Check the video description below for other places you can find and follow my work. I've also listed all of the links that are referenced in this video in the video description below. There are also ways there where you can help support my work. I don't monetize my YouTube channel. I'm not going to. If an ad ever pops up, it's not doing me any good. Feel free to skip it. And if you do want to support my work, please do so through Buy Me a Coffee and also Patreon. And to everyone who has been helping out, whether it's one-time donations, month-to-month donations, or even if you're just helping share my work with others, thank you so much. That is what makes this work possible. Thank you again, and as always, thank you for watching.